Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Maitri podcast Between Friends Conversations with Maitri. I am your host, Nandini Ray, and I am thrilled to have you with us today. If you are joining us for the first time, let me share a little bit about Maitri. Since 1991, Maitri has been dedicated to providing free, confidential, and culturally responsive services to victims and survivors of domestic violence, primarily from the South Asian community. Through this podcast, we aim to raise awareness around domestic violence, gender-based violence, and related issues. Each episode is crafted to offer valuable insights and resources, not just for survivors, but to educate the wider community on the importance of violence prevention. In this episode, I'm inviting you to the third presentation of Policy Matters with Smita Chandrasekhar.
According to research, over 300,000 minors were married in the United States between 2000 and 2018. There are only 13 states in the US that have banned child marriages, and more importantly, our state, California, is not one of them. Moreover, there has been a steady increase of child marriages in California over the past few years. Now, there is a movement brewing to bring about a change of the status quo through federal advocacy. In today's episode of Policy Matters, I interview Carter Swegman of Tahirih Justice Center on this issue and learn about the upcoming federal proposal to address child marriages nationally. My name is Smita Chandrasekhar, and I am a senior at the University of Washington, deeply committed to promoting the rights of survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault to their own bodies and autonomy. When we mention Western industrialized nations, such as the United States and many countries in Europe, they are historically assumed to be a haven for families and underprivileged communities alike. However, certain practices often regarded with prejudice towards more underprivileged nations are not limited to them. One such practice is child marriage. UNICEF USA defines child marriage as the formal marriage or informal union between a child under the age of 18 and an adult or another child. As we know, child marriage is an internationally recognized human rights violation and a global problem. An estimated 640 million girls and women alive today were married in childhood. Nearly half of the world's child brides live in South Asia, approximately 45%. With the next largest share from sub-Saharan Africa at approximately 20%. Why is this happening in the United States? I asked Carter Swegman, a national expert on serving immigrant survivors of gender-based violence. As the Director of Public Policy at Tahirih Justice Center, she oversees Tahirih's state and federal policy advocacy focused on improving protections for immigrants, survivors, while simultaneously seeking long-term and systemic change.
That's a really interesting question. And I think it's one that we as domestic-focused advocates get a lot, that there's a surprise that child marriage is happening in the United States at all, and that it's legal in most states across the country. I think the drivers of child marriage are complex and varied. I think in the United States, we have certainly served individuals where poverty played a role. Where there was economic strain within the family and the idea that marrying off a child to someone else would relieve economic and financial burden from that family, even if it was against the girl's consent and was not in her best interest. We have also seen religiously motivated child marriages. I think in the United States, we also have the same issues with gender equity and control over female sexuality that people see all over the world. I think there's a consistent sense that the United States is somehow exceptional in these areas. When we talk about ending child marriage globally, almost every researcher or journalist will leave out the United States in those conversations and in that data. And unfortunately, we do see child marriage as a tool of controlling girls' sexuality, girls' gender identity. We do see it as a way to entrench long-held gender roles and expectations. And those things are universal across economic strata, education strata, religious, you name it. And so if I'm thinking specifically about the clients that we have served at the Tahirih Justice Center, we see all of those things playing a role in the cases that we have served. So regardless of someone's background, child marriage is happening across communities. And I remember this one quote from a client, blonde hair, blue eyes, and she said, "My mom looked like the perfect soccer mom, and no one would have believed what was going on behind closed doors." And when we think about our clients from marginalized communities, thinking about clients from the South Asian community, they in fact have the opposite problem where there's extra scrutiny on them, lots of assumptions about cultural practices and tradition, but none of that actually leads to girls getting the help that they need. When they reach out and come forward to say, "I'm facing this at home, I need help," a lot of the times they're told that sounds like a family problem or that sounds like a cultural problem, and we don't want to get involved. We don't know what to do. And so in both scenarios, girls are being failed despite, in both scenarios, girls are being failed because of the stereotypes that we have about different communities.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Thank you so much for your response and for providing us that insight on how child marriage might be different and also similar between different world countries and the US. So our next question is regarding specifically the Child Marriage Prevention Act. What are just like the main overview of this bill? What is it? What is it intended to do? And just its general purpose?
Yeah. The Child Marriage Prevention Act is a piece of legislation that I am really excited about, that I know the sponsors are very excited about, and lots of folks have been waiting a very long time to see. We know that we have both a homegrown child marriage problem in the United States and an issue with older U.S. citizen men, quite frankly, bringing over young girls from abroad under the guise of marriage and fiancé visas. Many of those girls who are brought to this country through that program then find themselves very isolated, abused, cut off from education, family, community, you name it. And we have also served at the Tahirih Justice Center minors with legal permanent residency status or children who are U.S. citizens who have been forced to sponsor much older adults from overseas. But I'll be honest, the bigger problem by far is the issue of older U.S. citizen men bringing children into this country to be their brides. And this bill does sort of a really incredible thing, which is to address both the homegrown problem of our state laws failing girls and our federal immigration laws failing girls both here and abroad and leaving them vulnerable to predatory men. So the Child Marriage Prevention Act addresses both and would create a federal commission to study child marriage in the United States. It would create grant programs for states to create task forces to study the issue, because we know that state-based data and state-based examples and survivor advocacy are really what helps move the needle on this. It's not as effective for big national organizations to come into a state and wave our fingers and say, "You're doing the wrong thing." It's much more effective and powerful for state groups and state survivor advocates to have the support they need to run a campaign on their own based on state-specific data that legislators are more likely to respond to. So those task forces and that money is really there to buttress those efforts. So state-based advocates can be funded to do this work, and survivor advocates aren't just being asked to do it unfunded, which we know is a major problem in our movement overall. It would also direct the Attorney General to create a model statute. So any state that thinks to itself, we do have a problem and we want to end child marriage, how should we go about doing that? Oftentimes finding model statute promulgated by the Attorney General is a helpful place to start. And here it's very straightforward. It's just don't allow marriages under the age of 18 to be civilly recognized, no marriage licenses for anyone under the age of 18. and a host of other things that we can do domestically to create carrots and sticks for states to make progress on this issue. Then it has an immigration piece, which would address the fact that there are no minimum ages by statute in the marriage-based visa program. So it would require that any U.S. sponsor, so the legal permanent resident or the citizen, would have to be 18 both at the time of petition and at the time of marriage for that to be valid for immigration purposes. That is not set by statute right now. A lot of people thought that it was, or assumed that that was the law, because of some other document that you have to sign by virtue of processing a marriage-based visa. But what we know from the data is that thousands of US minors were approved to sponsor, despite the fact that that obligation to sign a contract existed in that system. So it would fix that loophole for the US sponsors and protect children in the United States. And then it would also require that the foreign beneficiary, so the foreign-born spouse or fiance, would have to be 18 at the time of that petition without exception. And that really helps to ensure that any foreign-born spouse has the full legal rights of an adult the moment they step foot on US soil. And that's important because we know that children and adults are treated differently in this country. A child calls a hotline for help and they're going to be asked, well, where are your parents? Where are your guardians? They try and walk into a courtroom to get a protection order. They're going to be asked the same question, even if they're considered emancipated, even if that state, like California, for example, does technically allow children who are quite young to petition for a protection order on their own behalf. A lot of court systems and judges just aren't aware that that's true, and they're going to be caught in this cycle of being turned away from help because they are perceived as children, which they are, and then perceived as having lacking rights and lacking standing as children. So this would ensure that both parties to a marriage, if it's a marriage involving someone who's abroad or not a US citizen or legal permanent resident, are 18. And in that way, at the very least, it ensures they are equally legally empowered under the law to seek help and access all those safety net services that are available for survivors in this country, but designed for adults.
Yeah, thank you. That's incredibly fascinating. And you actually created the perfect lead into our next question. We know that certain states have banned child marriage, such as Delaware, Pennsylvania, etc. However, we wanted to know how this bill and this initiative is going to differ on a federal level, both in a good way and in a bad way, or potentially in terms of like obstacles and opposition on a federal level versus how it's been being handled currently on a state level.
Yeah, so I think the big, broad challenge that we have, if you want to put it that way, is that the way our Constitution is written does not allow the federal government to set a minimum age of marriage with the stroke of a pen, to say all 50 states and territories, this is the minimum age of marriage. This is an area of law that is reserved for the states to legislate. And so it does require 50-state campaign to end child marriage at the state level in our state capitals. And so we worked with constitutional scholars, we worked with Senate research staff to try and see if there was any way to make a different argument. And I'm still open. If someone can think of a creative way to get around what we currently see as the constitutional obstacle, very open to hearing it. Right now, the smartest people I know haven't found that way through. And so that's not going to deter us, though, from using the power of the federal government to set norms. This bill does exactly that. If it were to pass, it says the federal government, Congress, and the White House is invested in ending child marriage in this country. How do we know? We appropriated money to that cause. We are giving funding to states to end child marriage. We are telling them to set up task forces. We are saying if they do end child marriage, they could be eligible for more grant money than those states that don't. We are putting the power of the purse behind this cause. That's the power of the federal government on this issue. The model statute, another powerful way to send a normative message about what the federal government wants to see from the states. And we've seen this in over history We've done this with things like laws related to seatbelt wearing, laws related to drinking and driving, lots of ways in which states are the ones who reserve the right to legislate on those issue areas, but the federal government uses the power of the purse and normative sort of norm setting to encourage progress. So that's the role the federal government can play in terms of our domestic laws. The one other thing that they can do, and that is in the Child Marriage Prevention Act, is to say child marriage will not be legal on federal land. So maybe this prevents only a small number of child marriages, but again, it's a normative statement that to say in all of our Smithsonian buildings where people do host weddings, in all of our national parks, in any space that is owned and operated by the federal government, child marriage is not legal and cannot happen in those spaces. So that's the role that the federal government can play, and it's a powerful one. And then, for better or worse, federal government also has full control over our immigration laws. And so that is a space where they can absolutely tighten up the rules to ensure that we are not seeing the exploitation of girls, whether born here or abroad, under the guise of marriage through our marriage-based visa system, and that those who are receiving that benefit are consenting adults living happy, healthy marriages.
Yeah, thank you so much. And in terms of discussing our federal immigrant laws and immigrants in general, do you see a way that specifically for immigrants, this act is either exponentially going to benefit or is adversely going to affect immigrants coming into the United States?
I think where we sit as an organization that is in a, Tahirih has, since the day we opened our doors, advocated for the rights of immigrant survivors to be safe in this country, independent of any marriage. And those doorways are the ones that we continue to advocate to keep open. That is access to asylum, that is the U visa for victims of crime, that is the T visa for victims of trafficking, and the VAWA self-petition for those who do find themselves married to U.S. citizen spouses who then abuse them and refuse to move them along in their immigration process and use that as an abusive tactic of power and control. Tahirih has been at the forefront of advocating to keeping those pathways for immigrant survivors open, and we continue to do that. In this moment where so many doors feel like they're being slammed shut, some folks might say, why would you close a door to an immigrant woman being able to come to the United States? And I would say it is not an immigrant woman coming to the United States, it's an immigrant child. And they should have other options. Marriage, right, should never be the only pathway to safety that a girl has. And so we are advocating for both of these trains of thought at the same time. It just happens to be a particularly challenging time in the space of humanitarian relief for women and girls who are fleeing persecution. But we all have to keep doing that in the same breath as we say, marriage should never be the only doorway to safety for a girl anywhere in the world. We've had similar conversations on the state level where states that do not have an emancipation statute, which is a failure of their state law and should be remedied, every state should have an emancipation statute such that an older adolescent who's very independent, mature, working, etc., can disentangle themselves legally from abusive parents who do not have their best interest in mind. We have stood in state legislatures and heard advocates for women and girls and youth say marriage is the only way for a minor to emancipate in this state, and therefore the only way for them to get out of an abusive family home. And our response to that is it shouldn't be. That is a frying pan to fire situation. We know of girls who have had men groom them to say, I know you're stuck at home. I know your family life is terrible. I know you're being abused. Come live with me, marry me, you'll be emancipated, and you'll live in my home. And only to find out later that that man did not have their best interests in mind, and they were facing yet another form of abuse in that person's home. So it's this frying pan to fire situation where if we set up a system whereby the only way to safety for a girl is to get married, we are failing them. That is the last thing we should say to any girl who's facing abuse, is that your pathway to safety is through marriage, and often through marriage to a man. I think that lacks insight into what survivors really need, and it certainly lacks creativity. And so I think in this moment, it takes a very well-reasoned advocacy approach to think about doing this at the same time as so many other pathways to the United States are closing, but they are two very separate issues. And just fundamentally, girls and women deserve better than just that one option.
Yeah, thank you. That was an incredibly insightful response into our immigrant policy and then also just what girls in this country could potentially be facing. And then our final question, and this is mainly a question for our listeners and what they can do for this issue. So what is your call to the general community and what the everyday person who may not be in policy, who may not be in legal advocacy or those kinds of fields, what can they do to support or promote this issue?
That's a great question. I think there's so much to be done on the state level and also stuff to be done, obviously, on the federal level with the Child Marriage Prevention Act. So I'll start on the federal level because it's pretty straightforward, which is we are hoping that it will be reintroduced this Congress in a bipartisan way. I see no reason why we cannot get bipartisan support for this measure. It has historically enjoyed bipartisan support when the US government has taken positions on ending child marriage globally. Politicians from both sides of the aisle are more than happy to speak out against child marriage anywhere else it's happening in the world, and they should be doing the same for their own girls in their country. And so if your senator has not yet spoken out in support of the Child Marriage Prevention Act, is not aware of it, we are encouraging folks to get in touch with their senators once the bill gets close to reintroduction, and that could quite happen, in the next couple of months, to become co-sponsors of the Child Marriage Prevention Act. And I would not hesitate to contact any member of Congress, no matter where they are on the political spectrum. This should be a unifying issue. So contacting your senators in Congress and encouraging them to educate themselves about this issue if they're not aware of it, with the resources available on our website and beyond, to get in touch with the primary sponsors of the Child Marriage Prevention Act and to co-sponsor it. That would be my number one ask on that front. On the more state and local level, you can find out from our website if your state has ended child marriage or not. Famously, California has not. And there's a long road to getting there, I think, in a place like California. But many other states haven't either. Maryland, where I'm born and raised and where I now live, also has not yet ended child marriage, even though it is surrounded by DC and Virginia, Delaware and New York, you name it, all the way up by states that have. So when that's the case, we need people every legislative session to be calling their state ledge members and asking them why we are so far behind on this issue when so many other states are taking action, especially when we see states like Missouri and Texas consistently introducing legislation to end child marriage and getting very close. There's no reason why we can't see every other state doing the same. So for me, it's always about, like, do you have a couple minutes once a week, once every 2 weeks, once a month, to call your legislators and remind them that this matters and it should be a bipartisan issue? And then in your very local level, in your conversations with people, I still have conversations with people who I would assume, by virtue of just knowing me, because I'm annoying and I never stop talking about things, would know that this is happening. But inevitably, every single time I'm at a happy hour or a dinner or what have you, there are people who are still shocked to know that child marriage is legal in the United States. And so the more we can educate people on the fact that that's true, and then go beyond that and saying it's not just where you might think. It's not just in Appalachia or the South or in rural areas or poor areas. It's everywhere. And we have the data to show that. And just opening up people's eyes to that truth will then turn into more activism, more education, more people demanding action on this issue. And so I think everyone has a role to play. At the very least, just becoming aware yourself that this is happening and educating others, because never have I can't think of a single training that we've done where someone does not come up afterwards or get in touch afterwards to say, I wondered what happened to that girl in my class, or I wondered what happened to that friend that I had. And I found out much later that she had been pressured to marry because of XYZ circumstance. And she wasn't able to finish high school, or she wasn't able to go to college, or what have you. And so the more we can have people who aren't realizing in retrospect what is happening, but are able to see it in real time and be able to be a resource, someone who is thoughtful and helpful to girls who might be facing this, that is the result of conversations and education and awareness. So there's lots people can do depending on what level you want to engage, where you see yourself most useful, but there's like no better time to start than today.
Yes, let's begin today by learning about this issue. You will find the Tahirih Justice Center's page on the Child Marriage Prevention Act, Maitri's podcast with child marriage survivor and founder of Unchained at Last, Freddie Reese, and other useful resources in the text portion of this podcast. Thank you for being with us today. Until next time, Smitha signing off.
Listeners, thank you for tuning in to the Maitri podcast Between Friends. Please don't forget, you can find all our episodes on Maitri Bay Area's YouTube channel, Spotify, and other podcast platforms. Please like, share, and follow Maitri's podcast and social media pages and spread the word. And please visit our website, maitri.org. Thanks again for listening. Bye for now. We will catch you in the next episode. Maitri is a free, confidential, non-profit organization based in the San Francisco Bay Area that helps families and individuals facing domestic violence. Don't suffer in silence. Call Maitri Helpline 1-888-8-MAITRI.
This show is for informational purposes only and is not to be construed as legal advice. Always consult an attorney for legal advice. Views expressed by guests of the radio show are individual opinions and not endorsed by Maitri.